case title: The Cold Case That Haunted Alaska for 37 Years. The Butcher Bakary am back with another story. This one begins deep in the icy heart of Alaska, where darkness lingers not just in the skies, but in the minds of men today. We uncover the terrifying trail of a soft-spoken baker by day and a brutal killer by night, a man who managed to evade justice for nearly 2 decades. His name Robert Hansen, and he would come to be known as the Butcher Bakerburn in 1939 in Iowa. Robert Hansen seemed like any other quiet child raised under a strict and often abusive father. He developed a stutter early on and was bullied for his acne and awkwardness. He found solace in solitude and in the wilderness, but as he grew older, the isolation began to twist into something darker. He became obsessed with hunting not just animals, but eventually women. In the 1960s, Hansen moved to Anchorage, Alaska with his wife and children, where he opened a bakery and quickly became a well-liked member of the community. People praised him for his pies and pastries. They had no idea that this polite baker had already been arrested twice for crimes against women, including arson and assault. Yet somehow each time he was given leniency and managed to blend back into society like nothing had happened. By the early 1970s, women, especially dancers and sex workers, began vanishing from the streets of Anchorage. Some were later found in shallow graves deep in the Alaskan wilderness, shot or stabbed and left like discarded prey. Authorities had no leads, no patterns, and no suspects. The victims were often transient women with no strong family connections, and their disappearances went largely unnoticed by the broader public. Hansen had perfected his method. He would drive around town and pick up women, promising them money for a quick job or a ride. He would then take them to his home, where he had a soundproof basement, and force them into submission. Some he would keep for days, torturing and assaulting them before flying them in his private bush plane to remote parts of Alaska, where he would release them into the woods, then hunt them like animals with a rifle or a bow and arrow. Wimaginy, the terror of being dropped in the middle of a frozen forest with no sense of direction while a man stalks you like a deer. Hansen got away with this pattern for more than a decade because he was careful, calculating, and targeted women whom society chose to ignore. It wasn't until 1983 that one woman, Cindy Paulson, managed to escape his grasp. Cindy was just 17 when Hansen abducted her. He chained her in his basement and assaulted her for hours, but when he left briefly to prepare his airplane, Cindy saw her chance and ran barefoot in the freezing cold until she reached the road and flagged down a passing driver. The police were skeptical at first, but her story was too detailed, too raw, and too exact to ignore. Hansen denied everything, and because he had an alibi and a clean-cut reputation, he was not arrested immediately. But Detective Glenn Flood was not convinced. He kept digging. He got a warrant to search Hansen's home, and what they found there shattered the quiet illusion forever. Behind the walls of his house, they uncovered a hidden cache of weapons, trophies, jewelry from victims, and a map marked with tiny X's. Each X was a spot where Hansen had buried his victims. Solace eventually tied Hansen to at least 17 murders and more than 30 assaults, though he later admitted to as many as 21 killings. Each one followed a chillingly similar pattern: kidnapped, tortured, flown into the wild, and hunted down. It was a fantasy only he understood, and Alaska's vast wilderness gave him the perfect cover. One. The evidence became overwhelming. Hansen confessed. He gave police chillingly calm descriptions of each woman, where he met her, what he did, and how she begged for her life. He recalled the tiniest details of how they looked, how they moved, even how they tried to hide. It was not remorseful. It was like he was reliving the hunting. 1980 for Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. He died in 2014, but the echoes of his crimes still haunt Alaska to this day. The forest trails where his victims ran and screamed are still there, silent witnesses to the horror that once played out in their shadow. What made this story even more disturbing was how long he operated in plain sight. A trusted man, a father, A baker praised for his cinnamon rolls, he was the last person anyone would suspect, yet behind those friendly eyes was a predator whose crimes were as cold and calculated as the land he hunted. In this case reminds us that evil does not always look like a monster. Sometimes it smiles, offers you a cupcake, and quietly plans your end from the darkness of its basement. So the next time you hear of a kind neighbor or a quiet man who keeps to himself, remember this story, remember the butcher baker, and remember that sometimes the most terrifying monsters walk right among us. The courtroom was packed that day in 1984 when Robert Hansen was finally brought to justice. People from all over Anchorage had come to witness the trial of the man they once called a model citizen. Reporters flooded the courtroom. Survivors sat trembling in silence, and families of the missing wept quietly, hoping for answers, some for closure, some for vengeance. Hansen sat motionless through most of the trial, his face blank as testimony after testimony revealed his true nature. A forensic psychologist who examined him testified that Hansen showed clear signs of antisocial personality disorder coupled with sadistic tendencies. He derived pleasure not just from control or violence, but specifically from the hunt. The chase was everything to him. It made him feel powerful in a life where he had always felt small. Confessed in great detail to some of the murders. Almost casually, he described how he let the women run, gave them hope before slowly stalking them through the snow with his rifle. He said it felt like justice, like he was correcting the wrongs done to him by the world and all the women who laughed at him in his youth. It was as if he had built a fantasy world where he was the hunter and the world his prey. The most haunting moment came when detectives opened his map, the one found behind a ceiling tile in his house with 24 tiny X marks across the Alaskan wilderness. Police eventually uncovered many of the bodies at those exact coordinates, some so badly decomposed they could barely be identified. Others were still missing to this day. Their X remains unsolved. As the trial continued, Anchorage was stunned. The quiet baker, the man who handed kids cookies and sponsored church events, was the most prolific serial killer the state had ever seen. His bakery shut down overnight, the windows shattered by angry residents. People left flowers for the victims in front of the now abandoned building. It became a symbol of betrayal, a reminder that monsters often hide behind kin. Nasoan survivor Cindy Paulson later shared her trauma openly. She became a voice for other victims of violence. Her testimony was what cracked the case wide open. She remembered everything: the wallpaper in the basement, the scent of his cologne, the red airplane. She had been handcuffed to a post when he left to refuel the plane. She still bore scars from the handcuffs years later. In an interview, she said escaping him felt like escaping death itself. Robert Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison with no chance of parole. He was sent to Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska, where he lived in near isolation. Guards reported he was quiet, polite, never caused problems, that never showed remorse. He kept a diary where he detailed hunting stories, not all about humans, but you could see where the lines blurred. There was always this underlying tone of conquest, of dominance over the weak. His fellow inmates largely avoided him. Some feared him, others simply wanted no part in his evil. He was known as the butcher baker, even behind bars, and everyone knew why. Psychologists continued to study him over the years, trying to understand how such darkness could exist inside someone so ordinary on the outside. One said that Hansen was a rare breed of predator, one who thrived not in chaos, but in planning, methodical and cold. A man who waited years to act on his darkest impulses and then perfected them like a craft. Died in 2014 of natural causes, but his death brought little peace. Many families never recovered from the loss of their daughters, sisters, and mothers. Many bodies were never recovered. Many names were never spoken because they had no one to claim them. These were the forgotten victims of the butcher baker. The legacy of his crimes changed how Alaskan law enforcement handled missing persons cases, especially those involving sex workers or transient individuals. Laws were changed, protocols updated, new task forces were formed, but for many it was too late. They asked why it took over a decade for someone to listen to the women who tried to report him, why no one believed them, until It was almost too late. One detective involved in the case said, "If it weren't for Cindy, we might still be looking at that map wondering what each X meant. Her courage saved lives and gave voice to the voiceless. Today, there is a small memorial in Anchorage dedicated to the victims of Hansen. It lists the names of the known, the confirmed, and leaves space for the unknown because the true number of victims may never be known." This case is a chilling example of how evil can wear a mask, how even the most brutal killers can hide in plain sight behind a smile, behind a bakery counter, behind a quiet demeanor. What makes Robert Hansen different from other serial killers is not just the cruelty of his crimes, but the cold calculation, the years he spent perfecting his methods, the way he used the wilderness not just as a dumping ground, but as a weapon itself. Asterisk.